What's up, everyone? It's your boy David, live from an undisclosed cave. Yep, still dodging King Saul. Honestly, you'd think the guy would chill out a bit after all those worship me vibes. Oh, thanks, fam. Just me and my loyal squad here. Hashtag mighty men. Who needs a palace when you have your own crew of misfits? So, y'all aren't going to believe this. Earlier today, Saul came into this very cave to handle some business. Yeah, my man came in here to drop off a scroll, if you know what I'm saying. My guys were all hyped, like, David, this is it. God just delivered him right into your hands. And y'all know what? I could have ended this whole thing. I could have ended it right here. Saul didn't even see me. I could have taken him out, but that's not how I roll. I know, I'm being too nice, but listen, revenge ain't my thing. Saul might be acting all wild and stuff right now, but he's still the Lord's anointed, and I'm not about to catch hands with God over this. Not today, Satan. And let me tell you, finding food in a cave, that's tougher than facing Goliath. This is dinner. If only manna would fall from heaven again. Oh, y'all are too much. But seriously, I know it's rough out here, and I'm clowning a bit, but real talk, I'm trusting God. I know I've got a future beyond this cave. It's just a matter of time. Thanks for the love, everyone. Keep praying for me. Maybe one day I'll be king if Saul doesn't get me first.
Good morning. My name is Stephen Spivey. Like Matt said, thank you to our squad of mighty men up here getting these chairs out. Appreciate that. And a little bit about me, if you don't know me, I've been on staff just over three and a half years here at Shoreline. I'm our production director now, and I get to work with some amazing teams of adults and students. Shout out to everyone running right now. Shout out to people watching online. That's made possible by some of our awesome production volunteers. And others of them you just saw up here. We have actually a student team now that runs our student ministry, which is so cool. Over the last 3 years, watching our student ministry grow. Shout out to that. If you're not familiar, we have Tribes student ministry for 7th to 12th graders, meets every Wednesday night right here in this room at 6 p.m. We'd love to see you. It's a ton of fun, and we've built a team and grown it to the point where we live stream, and it's just like a Sunday morning, but for students on a Wednesday night, so it's super cool. In fact, someone suggested to me a few months ago we start kind of a employee of the month type, volunteer of the month thing, and I said, oh, that's a good idea, but this is student ministry. We're working with teenagers, so we got to make it a little more fun than that. And so we have we call it our Tribe Production Punk of the Month. Last month was Connor, who you just saw up here. He is awesome. I've known Connor since he was in 7th grade, and watching him grow from a little goofball of energy, which he still is sometimes, but watching him grow and now lead other students, showing initiative and drive and a spirit of excellence is so incredible to see. And so this morning, like Matt said, we are in this series called Tale of Three Kings. And Tale of Three Kings is an in-depth look into the lives of three historical figures. And in this, we'll find a love story, a warning, and also a practical survival guide for what to do when your king has gone mad and begins to throw spears at you. And how we respond will truly reveal on which of these three thrones we choose to sit and rule as the king of our lives. So today, we're talking about King David, and we're specifically focusing on his time in the wilderness, both when he was a shepherd tending his father's sheep, but then more specifically his time in the cave, which you kind of saw a little bit of in that video. One of many caves that David hid in over the years he was running for his life from King Saul, who was trying to kill him out of jealousy. And I have to say, while prepping this message the last few weeks, I've actually felt a lot more connected to David and his time in the wilderness, maybe than I have at other points in my life. And that's partially, I'll say I was actually afraid some of you might not recognize me today. If you were here last week, you got to hear that I have started something new in my life. I haven't changed a whole lot in the last 3 years, but recently I've begun my beard journey. It's happening. I was on a trip out west with Pastor Eric, went out to Utah in the desert, and we were camping. It was awesome, and I said, you know what? I'm just going to embrace the scruff. We'll see what happens. Here we are about a month and a half later, and it's kind of working, I think. I will say I open my phone sometimes to the front camera, and I do a little, jump scare. I'm still not used to it, but, it's grown on me, literally. That's my dad pun for the day, making Donnie Carvonen proud down there. But yeah, we were out on this trip, and I started prepping the message, and I feel like I caught a glimpse of maybe what David experienced in his younger years. Again, when he was a shepherd out with just a flock of sheep who I'm assuming weren't great conversationalists. It was him and out there in the wilderness. And I think David was able to get a glimpse of more of who God was and more of God's nature by being surrounded by nature and the creation that God had made. It was beautiful and amazing to look up and just see stars, tens and hundreds of thousands of stars, which a photo doesn't do it justice, but I was shocked I captured anything in the photo. And to look up and see the beauty of all God had made, the fullness of his creation. But at the same time, it was easy, and I quickly saw how lonely it could be, how isolating, how desolate, even depressing at times, spending days and days without anyone to talk to. I was able to visualize for David not just that time when he was a shepherd, but later, after he'd already been anointed, been told, been promised by God that he would one day be king. He then spent years serving King Saul in his palace, playing the harp for him, and then to have to run for his life, to have to leave everything behind and find a cold, probably dark, probably kind of gross cave to live in and call home. And in that cave, we see David have breaking moments. Have you ever had breaking moments in your life? Points where something went wrong, where you were under attack and things fell apart. You had that one mistake, that one misstep that shattered a relationship, that left you wanting to fight back, to try and regain control, maybe to get revenge, because maybe it wasn't a mistake you made, it was something that someone else did to you. And still you're left there trying to regain control and put the pieces of your broken life back together. David had more than a few of those times, like I said, from isolation in childhood to then dodging spears from a mad king as he grew older, eventually to missteps of his own when he wore the crown on his own head years later. But I want to rewind a bit before we get into that. Pastor Donnie touched on it last week, but how did David go from shepherd to Israel's army's most wanted fugitive, hiding in caves? We're going to look at 1 Samuel 16, and this is where we see David chosen as king. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem, for I have chosen one of his sons to be king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he'll kill me." So this wasn't a light thing. This wasn't a lighthearted, casual matter. This wasn't Samuel saying, okay, I'm going to take this olive oil, pour it on this kid named David. In 20 or 30 years, King Saul will resign or retire or die or whatever, and then David will be king. It's great. No, this was actually a lot more serious, because with this one act of anointing a different future king who wasn't from Saul's lineage, Samuel was basically calling Saul a failure. He was saying that Saul was a fraud, he was illegitimate, and he didn't deserve this throne that he had worked so hard, that he had bled for. If you were here last week, you heard the stories of battle after battle King Saul won to establish the kingdom, because he was Israel's first king. And God was with him in many of those battles. Cut to 1 Samuel 16:10. Jesse had 7 of his sons passed before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons that you have?" "There's still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He is tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent for him and brought him in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. So, David's anointed as the future king, but that wasn't public knowledge. In fact, we're given no indication that King Saul had any idea that Samuel had done this. We're led to believe that Saul probably has no idea that the boy he's about to hire to play the harp for him is the biggest single threat to his kingship and the future of his family line. Flash forward to David's first real chance to test his strength, to prove his mettle, see if the anointing is legit and if he has what it takes to be king. It's a story that even if you've never picked up a Bible in your life, you've probably heard it, one of the most well-known stories from the Bible, David versus Goliath. It's the ultimate smackdown on display, prime time. The Israelite armies on one side, all the hordes of Philistines are on the other, and David strolls in. In 1 Samuel 17, we basically see David taking some snacks out to his brothers because they were warriors. They fought in the army, and he goes to take them some food. And when he gets there, he doesn't waste any time jumping in, offering to face this 9-foot-tall giant from the enemy forces. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." And Saul replied, "You're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he's been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep." I imagine Saul looking back at him a little confused. Are sheep dangerous? Is that somehow trained you for this? But David goes on to explain, "When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Which sounds really encouraging, right? But I really imagine he was more saying like, "Okay, we'll get your coffin ready. Like, this is not going to end well for you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic, and he tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I'm not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with a sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. So most of us know how this story ends, but I'm actually a lot more interested in the middle of this story. See, it's easy for us to sit here confident knowing that David is the underdog and he wins. He wins the victory. He's the hero. He's celebrated by all Israel. They sing songs saying that David has killed his 10,000s they credit him with for this one victory. But how did David have confidence in God? How did he have confidence not even in his own abilities, but that God was actually going to come through for him and do what David was believing he would do? And when looking at it, I found that, to me, it seems like David had confidence in God because he had spent time alone with God. He had spent time alone with him, seeing God make himself evident firsthand. We see David worked hard, and he was capable of a lot. He had killed lions and bears on his own. He wasn't weak. But at the same time, right there in verse 37, we see David knew that God had won those victories for him, and God had provided the way. God had prepared him for that moment. David said, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the bear." God delivered David from those threats, and so David knew that God was infinitely more capable, that God held him in his hands and directed his future, and all David had to do was follow what God was asking of him, was surrender to him. David never tried to take credit for his victories because he knew only God was worthy of that credit, and he was the one who had won the victory. And so we see that David was humble. But humility doesn't mean that David was meek and mild. Humility does not mean there's weakness there. In fact, humility, true humility, is confident in its calling, and it doesn't feel the need to prove its strength to others. David didn't refuse Saul's armor because he wasn't capable of wearing it, but because he knew it wasn't his to wear. He knew it wasn't what God had given him to wear. David was strong. We see him jump at that opportunity. He wastes no time. He's not hesitant about fighting Goliath, even when no one else in the Israelite army would dare to approach, not even King Saul himself. In fact, if we want to get a little sneak peek of the rest of David's life, of his character, we see David go on to eventually become a king, and for years he conquers, he brings peace to their enemy nations and establishes Israel firmly. And at the end of his life, he goes to God and asks for the privilege of building a temple. He asks God if he can build his dwelling place physically so God can have a permanent space to be worshipped there in Jerusalem. And God comes back to David and says, "David, I love you. You're a man after my own heart, but your hands are covered in the blood of your enemies. Your years of violence and strength have established this nation, but you're not fit to build this holy, set-apart temple to my name." David was able to be a man after God's own heart because David saw the heart of God. He saw God for who he was, David's years in the wilderness had drawn him closer, had exposed to him the depth and breadth of the creator of the world. And David had developed an intimate relationship with God. David's time with King Saul, on the other hand, had taught him what a mad king looked like, what it felt like to be broken by unjust attacks from someone who God had actually anointed and placed in authority. One of the things we learn from the story of David is that praying for authority and honoring the authority over us is actually asking for those breaking moments in our life. When David had his first real breaking moment, he had a choice. He had a choice whether or not he was going to throw the spears back at Saul. Saul started throwing spears, and David could have thrown them back, or he could have chosen to stay and risk dying at the hand of a mad king. And when choosing to leave, David could have chosen to rally people to his cause, to say, hey, everyone, look over here. I'm actually anointed. Saul is a fraud. It's my time. He could have campaigned, and he could have built support. He could have revolted or tried to go and establish his own kingdom elsewhere. But once again, we see David choose humility and to trust God. David leaves alone. He turned his back on a spear-throwing king, and instead he ran somewhere he knew he could find God, in the solitary isolation of nature and of creation. Now, this idea of spear-throwing sounds maybe a little dramatic, right? When I was putting this message together, I got images of like cartoon, Tom and Jerry, they're fighting. One of them gets pinned to the wall by an arrow or something, and no one really gets hurt because it's a cartoon. I saw like a spear hitting a target and going boing, that kind of cartoon sound effect. Speaking of that, do any of y'all remember those door stops that are like mounted to a wall, the spring ones, and like the door opens and hits it? I don't see those much anymore, but as a kid, I would just sit there and like flick those, and they go da 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 da, and I do that for like 10 or 20 minutes. I was fascinated, and my poor parents would come and kindly redirect me to play with something less annoying. But no, I really want to take a minute and look at how damaging, look at the severity and the weight of what having a spear thrown at you means. And in order to do that today, some of you might have spotted, I brought my handy-dandy spear. And I got a little more than I bargained for. I asked our facilities team if they could put this together for me, and it's this thing is legit. And we have this cover on it because it's really sharp. Like, this guy is like legit, could stab something. Like, it's a little concerning. I was going to have a prop up here with me today and stab it into it, and I realized how intense it was, and I said, yeah, I'm not going to do that. That would break everything we own. So, but y'all get the idea here. That this thing is more than just a cartoon. This is more than just, it's not an insult. It's not something light. But this is life or death. And I've actually, over preparing this message, and then even over the last few years, seeing things in movies, TV shows, I've become a bit obsessed with the elegance of the spear as a warrior's weapon. Now, I don't know if any of y'all have seen the show Game of Thrones, and I don't think I can recommend it in good conscience. Have to do a lot of fast forwarding. But in the show, there's this character, one of the main characters, and him and his whole legion of elite warriors who are trained from childhood fight with spears and shields and very light armor. And watching them fight, they're going up against knights in full plate armor, and they have, swords, a lot more maneuverable. And the fight scenes, again, this show is it's HBO, so the production is movie quality. And watching them in battle, the agility and the speed it takes, the accuracy it takes to be able to fight in close quarters with this is really, really impressive. And all that to say, this is not a toy. This isn't something that David could just kind of shrug off and ignore. The spears that were being thrown at him were so much more than insults. They were more than just grocery store gossip. They were life or death in a single blow. And had the spears found their mark, it would have killed or maimed or derailed, altered the rest of David's life, however short that would have been if they'd hit true. And yet David, who was the warrior, the giant slayer, the lion killer in the prime strength of his youth, never threw a spear back. Not even once. Even though it would have been so much easier for David to return the spears that Saul was throwing at him, because then at least Saul would have had to dodge for a moment. He would have had a brief reprieve from the attacks while his enemy had to deal with one of his own. And it would have felt so good just to take control and have that release of sending something back the other way. We just had an election in our country. Some of you in this room or watching online are really happy about how things went. And some of you are really not. And some of you don't know how to feel about the state of our nation right now. Some of you feel like you've been dodging attacks for the last 4 years against your livelihood, against your belief system, against your families. And some of you are afraid that's what the next 4 years has in store for you. But if there's one thing we can learn from the life of David and from this story, it's that we live in a broken world. Not all authority will be perfect, but God will always use it and operate through it. And when we have to stand up against authority and suffer consequences, we're told that, and we're promised, that God will be there and honor that suffering when we're walking in step with him. We see God kind of explain that. Hebrews 11. It says, "How much more do I need to say? It would take too long to recount the stories of faith of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and Samuel, and all the prophets. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, they quenched the flames of fire, and they escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength, and they became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. But others were tortured. Refusing to turn from God in order to be set free, they placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prisons. Some died by stoning. Some were sawed in half, and others were killed with the sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground." This passage is what radical faith looks like. And we see David mentioned in both groups. We see him defeating armies, shutting the mouths of lions, but we see him have his seasons running from oppression and hiding in the caves. And it's one thing to get to this place of surrender, of walking daily with God, having this radical, fully surrendered faith. But once we're there, how do we stay there? What keeps us from getting discontent, from starting to throw spears of our own, or just returning the spears of others? What do we do when it's so tempting just to pick up the spear and just throw it, hurl it as hard as you can? To at least, again, have some semblance of control, to feel like your life isn't spiraling. How did David do it? How did he hold on to the spear and resist throwing it back? Or better yet, just to drop it altogether? Let's look at David's own words. In Psalm 54, he said, "Save me, O God, by your name. Vindicate me by your might. Hear my prayer, O God. Listen to the words of my mouth. Arrogant foes are attacking me. Ruthless people are trying to kill me, people without regard for God. Surely God is my help. The Lord is the one who sustains me." Psalm 57:7, "My heart, O God, is steadfast. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make music. Awake, my soul. Awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the peoples." David worshiped in the fields. David worshiped in the palace. David worshiped in the caves. David was always worshiping. Psalm 59:2, "Deliver me from evildoers and save me from those who are after my blood. See how they lie in wait for me. Fierce men conspire against me for no offense or sin of mine, Lord. I have done no wrong, and yet they are ready to attack me. Arise to help me. Look on my plight." Worship is what keeps us there. Worship keeps us seeing God for who he is and seeing who we're made to be in him. It brings peace to the chaos. In fact, in the face of injustice, of dodging attacks, our whole lives should be worship, culminating in a Sunday morning experience where we can pour that worship out publicly, even in the midst of our trials. We see that worship is also protective against the enemy attacks. Proverbs 15:1 says, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." When we're centered in worship to God, to our true King, we're actually able to respond to our enemies with gentleness and even kindness. And this was a turning point in David and Saul's relationship, if only for a brief time. What we alluded to earlier in the video is a story when David was out hiding in the caves and Saul goes to hunt and pursue him to kill him. And David and his men are in this cave, and Saul had to handle some business. Nature called, if you know what I mean. And he goes into this cave, and David and his men are in that very same cave. I can imagine David's group of men trying to keep quiet, saying, "Shh, guys, this is it." I can imagine how excited they were because they came to David. They said, "David, look what God has done for you. This is it. This is God's provision. This is a miracle. What are the odds? This cave right now while we're here." They said, "Go, strike down Saul, kill him, take the crown, take the throne, take the nation, lead us into this next golden age for Israel, fulfilling all of what God has promised you." For them, this was revolution. This was salvation. This was everything. And David refused. He said, "No." He said, "Saul is the anointed king, God's anointed. I won't harm him." And so Saul leaves the cave, and then we see what happens next. 1 Samuel 24:8. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord because he is the Lord's anointed." When David finished saying this, Saul asked, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" And he wept aloud. "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good that you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king and that the kingdom of Israel will be established into your hands." Keeping a God-centered view not only brings peace, but it inspires others. Now, sadly, we never see Saul get to have his redemption arc. He goes back and forth between moments like this of feeling so apologetic, affirming David as God's chosen as the true king, and then moments later we see him once again hunting, looking to kill David, and then feeling sorry, feeling pity over that, and then going back to try and kill David. But in this moment, David's act, David's humility, bowing before the king, a man who wants you dead, who you could have just killed, bowing down humbly before him, changed Saul's heart. Seeing the surrender David had to God, knowing the truth that God was with him, what it does is it also creates followers organically. David never recruited an army. The men who were with him, he never put up, campaign ads. He never put up posters or flyers on the bulletin boards trying to get people to his side. People saw the breaking. They saw the persecution from King Saul and how David responded. The men saw his authenticity and humility, and they flocked to join him. Hundreds of men by the end of it. Because the truth is, true leadership doesn't have to promote itself. David's response to his men when they urged him to kill Saul was, "Better he kill me than I learn his ways." David didn't need to compare himself to another king or try and measure up. David did one day become king, and he was, for the most part, an excellent king for many, many years, for decades. But I have to wonder if it's possible that David never would have made it to that place. Maybe David wouldn't have been a successful king if he hadn't first lived under King Saul. If David hadn't had the experience dodging spears, would he then maybe have thrown spears of his own? Would he have turned into a Saul, been arrogant of his own strength and power? Because again, David was so strong. And asking that question then leads to the question of, is the mad king in my life, in your life, actually part of a process? A breaking process to help draw us closer to the heart of God, to help us see as God sees, to help us trust God where we're not strong enough on our own? Is that boss, that parent, that manager, teacher, that coach, that board member? Whether the attacks are personal and intentional, or even if they're circumstantial, it doesn't make the spears hurt any less. But maybe is that part of God's plan? Or maybe not even God's plan, but is God going to use that to create in you the person he needs you to be? to help mold you into a man, a woman after God's own heart. So I want to close with a recap of what Donnie talked about last week. And when we were looking at King Saul and the mistakes he made, the eventual decline that led to his downfall, there were 3 mad traps that Donnie mentioned. And for us, I think those can actually be 3 heart checks, ways to check our heart and see which throne we're sitting on. And these were 3 things that David managed to avoid for most of his life when he was in a healthy space with God. And the first is comparison. Comparison, and the question is, are you wearing someone else's armor? David didn't accept Saul's armor not because he wasn't capable of it, but because he knew it wasn't his. He knew it wasn't what God had been preparing him for all those years in the wilderness as a shepherd. Instead, David took his shepherd's staff and his sling, and he did what needed to be done, and he trusted God to do what only he could do. Next is compromise. Are you picking up a spear? David spent years running from Saul, dodging these attacks, and he never once picked up a spear. Every time, he trusted God to be his salvation. He trusted God's timing and provision. And the last is control. Are you trusting God, or are you trusting your own strength? David had the opportunity, easily within his grasp, to kill Saul in that cave, to get everything God had already promised him. God had promised David the kingdom and the throne, and David could have taken it right there. But instead, David left it up to God. He surrendered that control. He didn't try and make things happen in his timing, or the timing of everyone around him was saying was right. He knew he needed to wait on God. Returning control to God, to the one who knows us best, who knows us better than we even know ourselves, is how we choose the right throne. David was a worshiper. Many of those psalms he wrote were sung. And there are some beautiful worship songs that speak these truths about our relationship with our Father, who he says we are, and how he wants to provide for us and meet our needs. Worship has been integral in my life. Worship's how I first came face to face with Jesus, understood what a relationship with God looked like, with the God who sees me and knows me and loves me. And I understood that for the first time in a moment of worship when I was 12 years old at a youth camp. I want to read you the words from these songs because I think they beautifully illustrate David's story. I know they're true of my story. They're probably true of your story, even if you haven't leaned in, haven't experienced it yet. The first one is one we sing here. It's called Firm Foundation. It says, rain came and wind blew, but my house was built on you. I'm safe with you, and I'm going to make it through. The next is called Defender, and it's a song that I discovered in college in some of my breaking moments where I felt like I had to run. My life fell apart, and I had to go to a cave, and I didn't see the way out of it. And the song says, you go before I know that you've even gone to win my war. You come back with the head of my enemy, and you call it my victory. And it goes on to say, when I thought I'd lost me, you knew where I'd left me. You reintroduced me to your love. You picked up all my pieces and put me back together. You are the defender of my heart. These songs, along with others, have spoken to me over the years when I've needed them most, in those breaking moments, or in rejoicing, or in uncertainty, or in my darkness. Worship, musical, prayerful, a lifestyle of worship is what has saved me. So it's brought me back to being centered on God each and every time when I've lost my way and had no way out. When we were out in Utah, when I was looking at those stars, I took a moment one night and I climbed up away from everyone else. All I could hear was the breeze blowing across the rocks, and I put on some worship music. And I didn't even sing along, which is really unlike me because I love to sing. But I laid there and I just looked and I listened. I didn't even listen to the music, but I listened to try and hear the heart of my Father. I worshiped not through words or action, but through silent, quiet surrender in my heart, and God met me there. I felt the presence of my Creator, of one who knew me so deeply, deeper than I even know myself. And God started to speak to me in that moment, not with an audible voice, but he started to direct my heart and my attention, directing my thoughts to areas of my life where I'd gone back and I was sitting on the throne of Saul. Areas of my life where I was trying to take control back and do it on my own, where I was comparing myself to other people, good people, those around me, friends, people I looked up to, and I wanted what they had, and so I started to compromise the path that I knew God had for me, which was different than the path God had them on, taking control to try and make myself more like them. If I'm being really transparent with y'all this morning, one of those areas of my life right now has been relationships. I'm 26 years old, I'm single, and a lot of my friends, most of my friends I'd say are married, or they're getting married. I feel like I have a wedding I go to every other month, and I'm the one who's still alone. I have friends, some of my closest friends, who have a beautiful family and a house full of children and laughter and love, and they do ministry through their families. They minister to people through their marriages, and I see that, and I know that it's good, and I want it for my life. And I know God wants it for me. God's told me that's what he wants for me, and he's just asking me to surrender and trust him, but I've started to walk away. I've started to grow impatient and discontent with the season that I'm in, and so I seize control. And I try and fill my life with things that, for a moment, maybe feel like they fill that gap, but they don't. They're hollow, and they actually draw me further from trusting God. They draw me further away from surrender to him. And so in that moment, he reminded me of that. He reminded me of my need to worship with my whole life, to surrender it all over to him and not try and do it on my own. So what is worship? More than song, more than words, what does worship look like in our lives? Healthy community is worship. Loving and growing your family is worship. The way we show love and kindness to strangers or our enemies or the broken in this world is worship. Generosity of our time, our talents, and our physical possessions is worship, and it brings us closer to the heart of our Father. Saul's heart turned away from God. He sat on this throne and he thought that it was his, that he owned it, he deserved it, he'd fought for it. And so he did whatever it took. He compromised and took control wherever he had to try and keep it. David, on the other hand, knew. He knew the throne wasn't his. He knew from his time under King Saul, he knew that God was the only one who was truly deserving of this throne, both in his heart and being the throne of anything else, leading the people of Israel. He knew God was the only one who was capable. Because in actuality, the right throne for us to choose isn't a throne at all, but it's recognizing that God alone is worthy, and our place is simply to kneel at his feet in worship and surrender to our true King, who loves us more than we can even love ourselves, who knows what's best for us, allowing him to lift us up, to provide for our needs, to place us on solid ground. So today, and every day, choose to put God on the throne of your heart. Choose to turn every aspect of your life into worship and watch God step up, provide for you in ways you couldn't imagine or even ask for. Watch him meet your needs, watch him answer your questions, and watch him show you that next step, the next good thing he has for you. Because we have a good Father, y'all. We have a good Father, and he wants the best for all of us. So Father God, this morning, I thank you for your goodness. I thank you for your unchanging nature. You are unwavering even when we waver so much, even when we have no consistency, God. God, I confess the times when I've tried to take control back from you, and I've seen it end badly every time. But I thank you for being patient with us, loving us through our mistakes, loving us in our brokenness, using that brokenness to draw our hearts closer to you, to turn us into people who can be there for others in their brokenness. I ask today that you would inspire us, speak to our hearts, wherever each of us is at this morning, Lord, that we would see a new area of our life we can turn over to worship and turn over to you, God. We surrender everything to you this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.